My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sankaran, Guru Piran Neo, fellow Jnanis. I'm going to continue with the evolution of the human species, particularly the Homo sapiens, because we need to know historically how we emerged so that we know that where we are going to go. So, and we covered from 300 over 1,000 years of our species in the plain of Africa, how we Homo sapiens have evolved over the various period of time. And in part 1, 2, and 3, I covered that evolution, and I covered the last 300,000 years, and now we are, in this 17th, 18th century, the early part of, and you see that, over time, I spoke about, we human beings establish many institutions. And what is very interesting is that part of our evolutionary story, how did religion and religiosity come? And one of the things that we see is that we as Homo sapiens started forming, communities and tribes to support one another, to sustain ourselves. And part of this is also that I think when we came together as species, we realized that there is something far greater than us. There must be a power greater than us. So we as Homo sapiens started looking up at the sky. We saw thunder, lightning, the sun, darkness, the whole works, and something that we have no control over. Over the years, we managed to have control over many things. In the early days, animals used to attack us. We used to be, all kinds of things harm us. And over time, through this cohesiveness, we were able to overwhelm many of the big species. Weather, we were able to overcome very difficult, harsh weather, and so on. So it made us more intelligent and made us think deeper. During crisis is when you see that our creativity goes up, because the part of built in our DNA is the survival instinct. And because of the survival instincts, our neural pathway makes more connections, and that connection helps us to become more creative. Having said that, we realize as Homo sapiens there are powers beyond us, powers beyond our biology. And this is where we started seeing, the ancient, religions. If you go back to Hinduism, Mesopotamia, Babylon, all these various ancient civilizations came up with, gods that refer to nature. So we had sun god, wind god, water god, all those things, because these are things that we have, we are dependent on, but we have no control over, right? So we put up to the heavens for guidance. So when there is a drought, we pray. When there is famine, we pray. So formal religions started coming together, and many of it, faith, and sometimes they pray very hard. Drought, suddenly rain comes, they believe that the heavens have answered their prayers. So various sacrifices were incorporated into what we call prayer. And this can be very, very evidently seen in one of the most ancient scriptures called the Rig Veda. In the Rig Veda, various rituals, fire rituals, various rituals were put in place to invoke these forces. Unknowingly, as they were doing all these rituals, they were also examining the various forces of nature. They were looking at fire, what is the composition of fire, what makes fire blaze very well. Unknowingly, they were also studying the chemistry of the forces of nature. Quite interesting that, they still look at winds, they look at night skies, they look at stars, and slowly, what was faith, they started thinking a little bit more deeper. And we can see that in many of the scriptures, and particularly in the scripture of the Rig Veda, it starts off with rituals. Then Yajurveda goes a little bit more deeper. Samaveda starts seeing the relationship between God, the universe, and the first time the depiction of the self. And we last one is the other Veda, Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Samaveda, other Veda. Finally, the last one talks about self-realization. So there was an evolution of this human mind that are starting to explore. So we see that many religions emerge to try to understand the forces of nature that governs us. Three things, the concept of God, which is something supreme to us, perhaps the creator of this universe, the universe itself, and our place in this universe. These are the three questions that many of the scriptures speak about. So as I mentioned, the religions became a very important, means of trying to understand famine, poverty, and then of course some scriptures have talks about karma and all those things to rationalize where these difficult good times and difficult times come. So this is still a belief system, right? But something very interesting happened, that over time, humanity was confronted with diseases that cannot be cured. And many people are praying, and still the diseases just ravaged. And, communities say, look, we can't do anything when the gods have ignored us. So, but great thinkers in these communities started thinking more deeply. There must be something that is causing this disease. And many of the scriptures also talk about you've got to transition from the ritual achara to vichara to be able to understand the universe really well. But most of them just were focusing on rituals. But great thinkers like Mahans and great saints and sages started probing deeper through this introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. And they realized that the macro universe is governed by the micro level universes. And in the micro level, there are microbes and other things that are also living that possibly could be the cause of many, many diseases and calamities. So in the ancient past, we see that the diseases were thought about, bad spirit and omen and all those things. But great thinkers started thinking, hey, as I said, they were examining this material universe very carefully. They were looking at the forces, they were looking at plants, they were looking at soil, they were looking at minerals. So this notion of alchemy is, they were looking at this, they're mixing things and looking. So the word chemistry comes from the term alchemy, you see, and great saints and sages, from Tirumoolar's time and thousands of years started, looking at the roots of plants and things that may have medicinal property. And this is where the whole Ayurveda emerged. So they were actually, these great saints and sages were scientists in those days, starting to look at, what nature, the forces of nature, the chemistry within the nature, and so on. So there was a great thinking, and this is where the evolution of the scriptures from rituals to vichara started taking place. And then what we started seeing is that the age of enlightenment, and people are starting to see nature with much more sharper. So the age of enlightenment in Europe, of course, this was in the East. This was already there for thousands of years. But in the age of enlightenment, we saw the discovery of telescope, we saw the discovery of microscope, and many of these great scientists were actually theologians. They were very religious, and they started probing, and the religious foundation gave them this foundation to go deeper. In the macrocosm, there must be microcosms, and they started looking, peering the sky, the stars, and we started seeing Galileo and others starting to develop telescope and microscope, and we saw the flourishing of mathematics and Newton's law, and all these things started emerging. But take a step back. Why did this happen? It happened during the time when plague diseases were ravaging Europe, right? And people were, millions were being wiped out by diseases. And they realized that something must be happening, something must be causing this. And most people thought it was bad omen, demons, and all those things. Until people like, Louis Pasteur and Edward Jenner and all these people started taking blood and peering under microscopes to see there are small microbes that are causing in the bloodstream that are causing this. And they tested different things. This is how we saw the emergence of antibiotics and all those things. But they had to peer deep inside the blood and to see. This is, so the entire inner cosmos was being examined, scrutinized, and the tools were already there. And if those discoveries did not take place, most of our lifespan would have been very short. Right? Most people lived up to 30 years old, no more than that. So this age of enlightenment really pushed the boundary of scientific knowledge. And because of a time when there was so much crisis, humanity was confronted a crisis that they needed to find. Religions to some extent gave comfort, but they were not solving the problems of disease and poverty and so on. So I just want to take you back. Remember the Homo sapiens that walked the plain of Africa, and because of scarcity of food, because of tribal things, they had to move to different parts of the earth in search for food. And because of the scarcity, there was a leap in the brain for them to make that adventure, go through difficult times, difficult climatical condition, adapt to those things. And adaptability gave them agility and creativity to be able to. In that same way, whenever humanity is faced by this crisis, they always, step up. And the same thing also happens to many biological beings. When they're confronted by extinction, they try to rebel. And this is what we saw in the COVID virus, that when new antibiotics are coming, we saw new strain of viruses which are more virulent. So they too were adapting and adapting to the climatical changes, the environmental changes. So we do the same thing too as a species. So we saw that, that scientific revolution, and Mahan speaks about this very carefully. This is part of that evolution that, we started seeing, infant mortality. People used to die in childbirth, both mother and the child. But science was able to overcome that, find out why, mothers die, and new surgical methods, and, giving birth and saving the child, premature deaths. Those days, the lifespan was about 30, 35. But today we are about 70, I think 74 for men and 76 or 78 for women. Lower diseases, people used to die of, flu and, tuberculosis and other simple diseases. But today we were able to find cure because of the science, and people are living longer. So there are positive things that science has brought in, but also as people live longer, the population grows, and there are other challenges that emerge. So to feed people, new tools and technology, agriculture, new ways of doing agriculture, minerals, exploration, experimentation, observation. Now, this is so important, a pursuit of self, a spiritual. We human species started exploring, experimenting, observing. And as we were doing this, we understood nature. We understood how the world operates. We understand the forces of nature, all the Newtonian laws and quantum physics and others. We were discovering these inherent forces of nature. As we discover the inherent forces of nature, we were able to master the power of the universe. As we master the power of the universe, we become really powerful. The people with knowledge become really powerful. And we saw this, in our history, that the European, particularly the Vikings, were exploring. If you look at the history of human, because of very difficult conditions in Europe, the winters, we saw the Vikings and others going to other parts, developing boats, and they became very, very powerful. The creativity, developing new things. So somewhat like tribes that became very, very strong and became very dominant. So they became dominant those days, spears and others, but they started discovering boats, traveling, discovering, various, more modern technology for exploration, discovery, and also arms, and we saw that, these small tribes became communities, became countries, small countries like Portugal and Holland started becoming very powerful because of science and technology, and mastery of this gave them the power to start exploring other lands, and colonization started taking place. So the European cultures and empires started expanding. Portugal was very small, but it is conquering massive land. England was very small, it was conquering, almost 50% of the world was under the British, monarchy. So we started seeing that exploration, so the one who has got the knowledge started becoming very, very powerful. So knowledge is really important. That is why you see that Swamiji emphasizes a lot of knowledge on jnana. Acquiring knowledge gives you mastery of the power, but mastery of the power also comes with responsibility. If you don't use it properly, it could harm not only yourself, but others. So I'm taking you through the scientific revolution that is taking place, that took place. That scientific, so this colonization led to, globalization. And I think you probably would have heard this term, globalization. We started seeing, when cultures go to other parts of the region, they bring their culture. So you see that the mere fact that all of us are speaking English, we are comfortable speaking English, means that the English Empire had an important role in shaping our worldviews and our lives, right? The same thing, we all dress. If you see, all of us probably are dressed, not in our own cultures, but dressed like, a Western culture, the same thing. So all these are part, and we eat similar foods. We used to eat, in banana leaf and stuff, but today we eat in McDonald's and KFC, and that's globalization. We watch the same movies. So we're starting to see that this colonization, because of power of knowledge, has enabled this global community become more and more homogeneous. So the world centered around European culture and norms because of colonization. And the traditional cultures, traditional local cultures were making way for the Western culture. We saw that in India, right? So if you see, the traditional cultures were starting to slowly be replaced, the language, and we saw that if you go to the South America, most of them speak Spanish or Portuguese. So we started seeing people embracing. In some parts of Arab world, you go, they speak French, right? So we started seeing that the communities that had the power of knowledge were starting to become more and more dominant globally. Very similar to what we Homo sapiens did to all the other species, right? Hominoids and others, we started wiping them out. Similarly, we are starting to see that dominant cultures are starting to slowly replace other cultures. Interestingly, that, as we became more and more globalized, the world centers on market economy and money. And this is a part of the Western civilization, that we saw that, money, markets, and barter trade, and, and so on. And interestingly, we see that, it became a global phenomena, that money became a dominant part of our lives. But what is really interesting is that as money and the market economy became very important, development took a different perspective. In the ancient days, people felt happy, they had their own cultures, they lived in although life was simple, they were happy. But as these, countries became more and more homogenized, or the homogeneity in terms of civilization, market economy started replacing. To sustain oneself, one needs job. Materialism is very, became a center part of our lives, jobs, homes, education. And we started seeing that the material life started replacing religious values and norms. As a matter of fact, many of the religious institutions themselves became more and more materialistic. To sustain themselves, they needed, place and wealth and all those things. So we see that even religiosity became tied to the material way of life. And you see that in all of our, religious teachings, we see that materialism has become core. So what the other interesting phenomena that is happening also is that the scientific thinking was replacing religious thinking. In those days, if you mean, many of the ancient scriptures used to talk about the earth is the center of the universe. No, that's been replaced by various astronomers. Now we are a small dot in, there's nothing special about the earth. It's like, all the other planets, right? Perhaps we have life. We have not discovered life elsewhere. We also started seeing that, the concept of human beings were created by God. But what we are seeing is that the thinking has changed from creation to evolution. So the Darwinian theory of evolution started becoming a main central way of how we human beings evolve. We were not, there's this school of thought that believed that we are image of God, whereas the scientific evidence shows that we are an evolution of a lineage of from the microbes right up to where we are, and we were part of that animal kingdom, particularly the apes and all those things that we evolved. So this is the Darwinian theory. Some still hold on to this, others don't accept this. But whatever said, I think the evidence shows more in the direction of this evolution. But this whole idea of Darwinian, the survival of the fittest, started imprinting in our human species. We saw that in the among animals, they fight. They became predator and prey, and we saw that in the hominoids and all the others. We saw that in the Homo sapiens that fight for territory and all. We started seeing this Darwinian survival of the fittest becoming imprinted in our modern economy, right? Capitalism. If you don't work hard, you would not get a job. If you don't work hard, your company will not survive. If you don't work hard and be competitive, you'll be wiped out. So this notion of Darwinian idea that you've got to be strong like everybody else, if you are given too much comfort, you see that over time you lose your competitiveness. So this notion of survival of the human beings, of this Darwinian philosophy, started imprinting in every facet of our lives, including the market economy, right? So we see that the strong, the bigger, the stronger, and the rich becomes richer, right? And also we see that the people who are enlightened will keep that knowledge for themselves. That is why you see that in ancient scriptures and in many great saints, they will not give it to everybody. Mahan was somebody very different. He acquired this knowledge and gave it for free to everybody else. But most would actually hold on or hoard this knowledge or hoard the wealth, because they want to keep it for their family or, their friends. So this Darwinian theory applied in every aspect of human, survival and also evolution. So the other interesting thing is science brought a lot of positive things, but it also spawned the consumer culture, the materialism. New products are coming, and people are getting better jobs, and you see that you start replacing things and you buy new things. So the consumer culture, the material culture is imprinted even more, right? And this is so in all the modernity and development, we have become more and more entrenched in our material object world. And this has some positive things because life became better. We were able to solve many problems, we were able to solve many grand challenges that impact society, from, poverty to health, better health, to transportation, education. All those things have positive impact. But it also created a consumer materialistic culture or way of life. People associated themselves with material wealth as opposed to the spiritual wealth. People associated their interactions and their relationship based on power and materialism. So here lies some of the challenges that as the mind becomes more and more anchored or wedded and welded to the material world, as how fleeting and transitory and ephemeral the material world, the mind too becomes like that. As how limited, the material world is, so does the mind becomes. So we see that while science has brought a lot of development, uh, it has also, uh, you know, had some major adverse impact. And science has unleashed tremendous power, but sometimes with power without responsibility can be an important challenge. So globalization has pros and cons, and this is part of if you see in the I God philosophy, somebody speaks about this. All those commandments that he puts in. He says you need to understand life in its fullest context, because then you know who you are, you know what the material world is, and what you are. Are you the material world? So, globalization has pros and cons, right? So not everybody is happy with globalization. One of the key things is that as people become more and more globalized, they adopt to universal values and cultures, it erodes diversity. We're starting to see languages disappear, way of life disappears. Take a look at some of our indigenous populations. Slowly, cultures, languages, way of life starts disappearing. We also start seeing that the survival of the fittest is now making the rich richer, and we see that the poor become poorer. And that is why we see that people are against globalization. You see, whenever trade talks, there's demonstration. People are not happy because they feel that they're not the poor people, the bottom 40% are not getting the support because of the survival of the fittest. So not everybody is happy. So in spite of all the modernity and development, society is still in turbulence. There are supporters of globalization too. They said the world has become more peaceful place. So there are pros and cons because we follow common standards, common values, human rights, all those things. So there are, one hand, it is made life better. We have better healthcare system, better education, all those things. On one hand, you have the positive things. The other hand, also, we see that the survival of the fittest. So as human species, as enlightened, we need to, enlightened ones, we need to understand these forces of nature so that we're able to manage our sukha and dukkha's very well to attain that samatva state. So there are positive things to globalization. How do we accentuate that? And there are negative aspects of globalization. How do we mitigate and minimize this? And this is what enlightened, lifestyle is. On the positive side, globalization leads to networks, trade, investments. And can you imagine small country like Malaysia, if you don't adhere to global standards, we would not find jobs, we would not find trade, we would not get investments. So the reality is that countries that do not follow the standards will not be able to benefit. Similarly, if all of us do not follow standards, we would not find jobs or, education and so on. So one hand, globalization brings standards, gives networks, trade, and investments. But also the challenge is that because we are all interconnected, a crisis in one part of the world also will impact all of us. Like we see, the Ukraine crisis has caused many challenges for many people, right? The COVID crisis in China spread across the globe. 2 years, we were all under lockdown. So while we become more and more connected, we see that any crisis in one part of the world impact all of us. While this is, the negative aspect, there is also a positive side to it. We all know then that in any part of the world, anything that are challenges will have an impact on us, which means that all of us collectively must ensure that crises are managed properly so that it doesn't have reverberate across. So this risk makes us think very carefully that we have to adhere to universal values. We need to become more and more universal. We need to become more and more caring. Whenever we see people suffering, we may not be impacted by it immediately, but their suffering ultimately will lead to us suffering. You see, so that interdependence make us think a little bit more deeper, that it becomes a deterrent for everyone to follow the rules, everyone to support one another. So that is why we see that a lot of advanced countries give foreign aid to other underdeveloped and developing countries, because when these countries thrive, they become a market for goods and services from the developed countries. And if these countries do not survive, or these countries have poverty, war, famine, people will start migrating, and you have refugees and all those things. So it impacts also developed countries. In that same way, as an individual, we may think, okay, myself and my family are good, we look after, but you see that, society, if we don't look after society, we see crimes going up, social problems going up, drugs going up. All those things ultimately will affect us. Crimes impact us, break into the house, drug addiction, all those things ultimately may come to closer to our home. So it is in our best interest to ensure that the goodness, the gracefulness, the positivity is permeated. And this is the interdependence that, Mahan speaks about, the universal values that we all should be adhering to. So I'm talking about, how technology and knowledge and science has got positive impact, but also has got challenges. So if we take back and see the 300,000 years of human beings, Homo sapiens, we started off with so much tribal wars. People used to die at a very early age. Most people died because of conflicts. But the 20th century is the most peaceful century. Tribal wars of ancient times have declined. Although we see wars, First World War, Second World War, all those things, but overall, in the last 300 years, when you compare, human beings have become more and more peaceful. And of course, after the Second World War, we set up United Nations. We've had some semblance of peace for 70 years, and now we have a crisis in Europe. Hopefully, it doesn't escalate to a third world war. But whatever said and done, the 20th century has been a rather peaceful. So the question, and this is statistics that you can see in that pre-agriculture, 30% of the males died due to violence. But today it is only 1%. Significant drop in violence, So, but why? It is because we have evolved, evolution of laws and institutions, reforms, and had made society more and more stable, and economies. So one can ask the question, what is all this got to do with spirituality? And if you see this, Mahan speaks about all this. Peace cannot come if you really don't understand the human species really well. The human species, has so much goodness, but also discovered so much power through science and knowledge. But, it also needs to adhere to responsible behavior. If we don't, it can cause major calamities. And this is where the spiritual values are very important. So while we have done very well as a species, and because of laws and reforms and institution, does that mean we don't have any conflicts? No. We see conflicts, in the 20th century and 21st century. There are conflicts still there. But, in the tribal war, 300,000, we used to fight with sticks and wood and spears, and, and although 30% of the males die because of this conflict, today with science and technology, if there is a conflict, the ramification is a major problem. Concern is that, large-scale war can lead to nuclear conflict that could annihilate millions of people in a second. So while we have become more and more developed, we have so much power, we have made life better, but the tribal instinct, the material human species, that is craving for land and material things, if it's not managed responsibly, has the potential to wipe out the entire human species. And this is where Mahans and other great saints and sages say that, These discoveries are very important, but the responsibility is also very important. And this is where the transition from that rituals and the material identity or the profit maximizing identity to a purpose, more spiritual values that harness and manage these forces really well. So we are in the brink of, we are in a crossroad as a species. If the war in Europe escalates further, I think as a species, we uh, are in for a very difficult time. So the question is that, are we happy with all the modernity and are we peaceful? The jury is still out there. Yes, to some extent, we have got some level of happiness. People are living longer. We know how to cure diseases. We have overcome a lot of poverty. Many of our own families, I remember my grandmother, lived in a very, very poor neighborhood. But within a generation or two, because of education and others, the family's lifestyle improved significantly. So we are some extent happy, peaceful. We have embraced both material, spiritual, and religious values. But with all the modernity, we have mastered many forces. We understand the universe, the discovery of the universe. The next question is that for humanity to take to the next step, it's not just mastering the material universe. We need to master another important dimension, which is the subjective aspect of us. It's not a material happiness that is critical. It is a subjective happiness that is everlasting and eternal. And that requires the human mind to step to the next stage of evolution that brings science and spirituality as one, spiritualizing science and scientifying spirituality. That leap, and we're starting to see great scientists and philosophers are starting to make that crossroad. And in my next satsang, I'll speak about this next stage of evolution is critical for human beings to shed off that tribalism that is bringing us to the brink of a World War III that could annihilate us. And this is why you see that Mahan spoke in after the World War about peace and set up universal peace. And great saints and sages and masters have been speaking about this. Until we discover the power of the human spirit, we will always gravitate towards a tribalism and conflicts, and it'll be a core to our being. The only thing now is that we have more powerful tools to not just, wipe, big number of people, but wipe out everybody on this earth. So in the next class, I'll speak about how do we make that leap to understand the subject and harness the subjective happiness, that universal values that Swamiji and other great saints and sages, how do we make that mental leap, that spiritual leap to be able to harness this? Sandosha.